LegalizeFreedom.com. Why are we here? Where do we come from? Where are we going? From the nature of reality to the future of humanity. Beyond politics, poverty and war. LegalizeFreedom.com.
Greetings and welcome once again to LegalizeFreedom.com. I'm your host Greg Moffat, and my guest today is Richard Heinberg, who joins us to discuss his latest book, Afterburn: Society Beyond Fossil Fuels. Climate change, along with the depletion of oil, coal and gas, dictate that we will inevitably move away from our profound societal reliance on fossil fuels. But just how big a transformation will this be? While many policymakers assume that renewable energy sources will provide a relatively painless solution, Heinberg suggests instead that we are in for a wild ride, a civilization reboot on a scale similar to the agricultural and industrial revolutions. Afterburn consists of 15 essays exploring various aspects of the 21st century migration away from fossil fuels, including short-term political and economic factors that impede broad-scale organised efforts to adapt, the origin of longer-term trends such as consumerism that have created a way of life that seems normal to most, but is actually unprecedented, highly fragile and unsustainable, and potential opportunities and sources of conflict that are likely to emerge. From the inevitability and desirability of more locally organised economies to the urgent need to preserve our recent cultural achievements, and the futility of pursuing economic growth above all, Afterburn offers cutting-edge perspectives and insights that challenge conventional thinking about our present, our future, and the momentous choices that we currently face. Hello and welcome, Richard, and thank you so much for joining us today on LegalizeFreedom.com.
Very good to be with you, Greg.
Now, today, Richard, we're going to discuss your latest book, which is entitled Afterburn: Society Beyond Fossil Fuels. Before we dive into that, just tell folks a bit about your background and your work.
Well, I've been writing on energy issues for about the last 15 years. I published a book in 2003 called The Party's Over, which was one of the first books to discuss the phenomenon of peak oil and its likely economic and social ramifications. And since then, I've written another half dozen or 6 or 8 books exploring different aspects of our energy dilemma. And the new one, Afterburn, is a collection of recent essays, and so it's sort of a greatest hits volume, I guess you could say.
Now, there can't be very many people listening to this that haven't heard the phrase peak oil and don't at least have some intuitive grasp of what it means. But for me, it's always been a little bit of a moot point as to, if a peak was when it would occur, how, why, how much there might be left in the earth in terms of fossil fuels, however difficult it was to get at, because the bottom line is that we live on a finite planet. And this whole mission of industrial society, fueled with fossil fuels, was only ever going in one direction, and that was that at some point, somewhere, someday, it would have to come to an end. And I think people have been in denial about this for a long time, but I think now we're beginning to see, again, we can debate when we think a peak has occurred or will occur, but we're beginning to see some signs now that, this is actually coming home to roost, so to speak.
Right, yeah. Oh, that's definitely true. During the last 10 years especially, we've seen dramatically increasing costs of oil production reflected throughout the industry. Regular conventional oil, the kind of petroleum that caused the economy to grow so dramatically and rapidly during the 20th century, regular conventional oil production hit a maximum in 2005, and we haven't seen any increase in world conventional oil production since then. All of the increase has been in so-called unconventional oil, which includes things like the tar sands of Canada, tight oil in the U.S., which is produced by hydrofracturing, ultra-deep water oil and polar oil. If you subtract those, and most of the increase in the last 10 years has just come from tight oil and tar sands. If you subtract those, then the industry is really treading water at best, and costs of production are increasing in the conventional category, just because the low-hanging fruit are gone, and drillers are having to target worse prospects and use secondary and tertiary oil recovery methods, steam and water flooding of fields in order to force up those last drops of oil. But also we're seeing especially increasing costs in the unconventional category. The unconventional oil is more expensive to produce because we're starting with lower grade resources. In the case of tar sands, we're talking about oil that was formed in a geological environment where there wasn't a cap rock, and so the oil migrated toward the surface and volatilized, largely volatilized. So what's left is this gooey, sticky stuff that has to be heated using large amounts of energy in order to transform it into some kind of usable liquid fuel. In the case of the tight oil, we're talking about a resource that was formed in place in often shale rocks, but in any case, rocks that have very low permeability. Geologists call these source rocks because, again, this is where the oil was formed. Typically, what happens is that oil is formed in source rocks and then migrates to limestone or sandstone, much more porous rocks, where it's a lower pressure environment. So that's why the oil migrates there, and where those highly porous rocks are covered with an impermeable cap rock, you have a reservoir. And this is what geologists have targeted since the beginning of the oil age. But those conventional reservoirs are largely tapped out, and so now the industry is targeting the source rocks themselves, where there's still original oil left in place, but the rock is so impermeable that it requires extraordinary efforts like horizontal drilling, use of explosives and chemicals, hydrofracturing, in order to coax the oil out. This is expensive. The wells deplete rapidly, and so even though it's being touted as a boom in many ways, as oil geologist Art Berman has called it, it's the oil industry's retirement party. So, folks who say, well, peak oil can't be happening because we have all of this new oil from tight oil and tar sands, really don't understand the basis of resource extraction, which is the low-hanging fruit principle. We've gone after the best, cheapest, and easiest first. Yes, there's lots of petroleum left in the ground, but increasingly what's left is harder to get, more expensive to get, depletes more rapidly, and has much higher environmental costs associated with it.
Given all those problems that you've just catalogued, difficulties, unintended side effects, etc., you would think perhaps that the oil industry in general would just shut up. They just go about extracting the oil and delivering it. But as you say, it's been touted as a boom, and there's been lots of talk over on your side of the Atlantic about the US becoming energy independent in a certain number of years. So it's almost like swung in the opposite direction. Instead of just shutting up and hoping that nobody notices that there's huge problems, they're actually sort of saying, hooray, it's, morning in America all over again.
I know. It's really, I have to say the last few years have been pretty frustrating for us. I work with an organization called Post Carbon Institute. I'm senior fellow there. And we've been, one of our major efforts as an organization is to just sort of teach people energy literacy and energy reality. And those efforts have been really thwarted in recent years by the amazing hype surrounding shale gas and tight oil in the U.S. It's true that large amounts of new oil and natural gas have been produced from these resources using the new technologies of hydrofracturing, horizontal drilling. But what people don't understand is the nature of the resources themselves, how these are much lower quality resources than have been produced previously. We did a study. Actually, we've done two studies, one in 2013 and the other just published this year, looking at shale gas and tight oil. We hired the drilling data and production data on all currently producing shale gas and tight oil wells in the U.S., and that's tens of thousands of wells. And we looked at the initial production rates from each well, the location of each well, the evolution of production over time. And what we found is that these are wells that decline very rapidly, typically about 70% in the very first year. So if you drill a well in January, by December of the same year, the rate of production from that well has already fallen by well over half. Also, looking at the locations of the wells, it's apparent that the well quality is highly variable. So there are relatively small sweet spots or core areas within each of the plays where tight oil or shale gas is being produced. And those core areas, in many cases, are only a county or a few counties in extent. And that means that the number of potential drilling locations within those core areas is limited. Now, outside of the core areas, production potential is much worse. Within the core areas, even within the core areas, we're talking about a business model that is pretty tenuous at best. The companies that have specialized in shale gas and tight oil have done so by taking on enormous amounts of debt. This is an expensive business, drilling, again, thousands of wells. And it requires a lot of money for leasing land. It requires money for drilling and well completion, fracturing, and so on. And very few companies have actually made money on sales of product. This is one of the secrets of the fracking boom that the industry does not want you to know about. It's just that simply the business model is a broken model. It's only worked because of a few factors. One is hype. They have successfully convinced investors that this is a bonanza and that everyone will eventually make money. And another factor is extremely low interest rates. The U.S. has had effectively zero interest rates since the crash of 2008. And that has enabled these companies to take on these enormous amounts of debt. Now, during most of those years, oil prices were quite high in the range of $100 a barrel. Even at that price, very few companies were making money, and even the ones operating in the core areas. But now, with oil prices closer to $50 to $60 a barrel, we're seeing cutbacks in drilling. Rates of drilling have fallen by half in the last 8 months. We're seeing layoffs to the tune of tens of thousands of jobs lost in the fracking industry. I think the number was about 75,000 a couple of months ago. I haven't seen an updated statistic. And these companies are bleeding red in their balance sheets. So what looks like a boom, if you scratch the surface and look carefully, is in fact really an act of desperation on the part of an industry that's nearing its final act.
It's interesting, actually, reading, as you say, your new book, Afterburn, which, as you pointed out, is a collection of writings published on different dates, that quite often in there you refer to how high the oil price was at that point.
That's right.
And, of course, now it's plummeted. But this ties in with the overall economic situation, because what I don't hear a lot of people talking about, certainly in the mainstream media anyway, is how demand in general has been affected by economic decline. And of course, one of the biggest expenses is fuel. And of course, the demand for that has been affected, and therefore the price gets affected.
Right. Energy is not just a commodity. Economists make this mistake all the time. They see energy as just an economy whose price is variable, but the economy is really all about labor and capital. Well, that's a very limited way of looking at the economy, because in fact, energy is necessary for everything. Without energy, literally nothing happens. We have an energy-based economy. Energy may only be 7 or 10% of the economy in terms of GDP, but if you take energy away, we have no economy. So when energy is cheap, economic growth is much more likely to happen. When energy becomes expensive, it's much more difficult to grow the economy. And with $100 a barrel oil, it was very difficult for the economy to recover from the Great Recession of 2008, 2009, even with the extraordinary efforts of central banks and national governments to bail out industries and banks, to pump trillions of dollars into the economy through quantitative easing, to lower interest rates to zero. In ordinary economic times, these kinds of efforts would have produced a post-recession boom, which is what a lot of economists actually forecast and expected. But instead, what we got was an extremely anemic recovery with very low energy demand, and that demand, of course, was constrained by price. So we've reached a situation where, for oil particularly, and I focus a lot on oil because it's our number one energy commodity, and it runs all of transportation, which in turn is all of trade is all about transportation. So oil is really at the core of global trade. We've reached a situation where there no longer is a Goldilocks price for oil that suits both consumers and producers. Consumers, the economy, really needs an oil price of $25 to, let's say, $70, maybe $25 to $60. If we're going to see further economic growth, we need oil prices that are affordable, that enable people to get around by car, plane, and so on, and have money left over to spend on goods and services, other goods and services. But the oil industry needs a price in the range of $100 to $120 a barrel in order to make a profit on unconventional production and on further exploration, upstream spending. Well, if there's no overlap there between what consumers can afford to pay and what the industry needs in order to expand, that means that oil prices from here on out are likely to be volatile and not supportive of consistent economic growth. We may have seen the end of conventional economic growth just as a result of oil depletion. And, this should be front page news headlines in Wall Street Journal and all of the economic publications. But instead, nobody's paying attention because this is something that's never happened before, and it falls outside the scope of normal economic analysis simply because economists have made the mistake of assuming that energy, and oil specifically, is simply a commodity rather than being the lifeblood of industrial civilization, which it is.
It's interesting. I'm always ragging on conventional economists on here because I did economics at college, and it was a waste of time, frankly. And it's interesting how an average person of reasonable intellect can look at a situation like the one that you're describing, come up with how they see it, a view of it, which is actually more rounded, more holistic, and more accurate than someone who's only getting their terms of reference from inside an economics textbook.
Yeah, I wrote a book just a few years ago, I think it came out in 2011, called The End of Growth. And I talk in that book about a lot of the things that we've just been discussing. But I also trace the history of economics and the history of economies in that book. And it is kind of a sorry story because the discipline of economics has grown up within this extraordinary bubble of time that we've lived through, and our parents and grandparents since the Industrial Revolution, which is completely different from any previous period in human history. And it's different because we've had access to the cheap, concentrated energy of fossil fuels that has enabled such rapid economic growth. And economists made the mistake of assuming that this growth was happening not because of these extraordinary energy subsidies, but because of markets. And therefore, as long as we have free markets, the economy will continue to grow. And they completely ignore the energy factor, which is actually at the heart of the engine that is the economy.
Okay, you cited your book, The End of Growth. I mean, that's what we're talking about here. And far from that even being considered, in the mainstream arena, whether from economists or politicians or business leaders, whatever it happens to be, all the talk is still about growth. And perhaps we should expect this. It's human nature. It's our psychology and what have you. And we're just coming up to a UK national election at the minute. And of course, all the politicians are on the television, on the radio, talking about growth, as that's all there is. In fact, it was interesting the other day, they had the head of the Green Party, and she was taking part in a phone-in on radio, and she was actually questioning growth. And the presenter was like, "You're just policy, you've got zero growth, he couldn't get his head around it. And the callers who were calling in, all they could talk about, no new jobs, it'll affect the economy. We seem to have orientated ourselves so thoroughly around, the economy, that's all anyone ever thinks about. It doesn't matter who lives or dies or loves or, does arts, culture, none of it. It's all the economy, stupid.
Yeah, and it wasn't always this way. The expectation of continual economic growth really only goes back to the middle of the 20th century. And the idea of GDP, again, goes back only a few decades. These are very recent phenomena, very recent ideas, and yet they've become sort of the bedrock of politics and the media that surrounds the economy and politics. The fact is, something has changed in the global economy, especially since 2008, but going back even a few more years than that. Economists are recognizing that the growth is fading, and they're scratching their heads. They're trying to figure out why this is happening. There's a term that they're using called secular stagnation. And some economists don't want to have any part of it there, and they say, "Well, this has got to be just a very temporary glitch." And others are saying, well, no, look, the economic statistics are very clear, growth is slowing down, especially in the older industrialized nations, even China. Japan is at zero growth or worse. Europe, what's going on here? Well, all of this was forecast, if you will. And maybe forecast is not the right word, but in an effort back in the early 1970s of a group of scientists at MIT who did the first computer modeling exercise for the economy in terms of ecological factors, in terms of energy, resources, population, and pollution. And this was, and of course, they used a primitive computer to do this. And the subsequent scenarios that they generated tended to show a peak and decline in world industrial output in the early part of the 21st century, which is where we are now. And that's exactly what we're seeing. Of course, they published their findings in a book, Limits to Growth, which became the best-selling environmental book of all time. It's the book that I read when I was 21 years old that set me on the path that I've been on ever since. And although the book was, widely criticized by mainstream economists, subsequent and very recent retrospective analysis has largely vindicated both the methodology and the conclusions of that study. Growth cannot go on forever on a finite planet. It's so simple when you look at the math of compound growth. Even at 1% growth, the size of the economy doubles every 70 years. At 2% growth, it doubles every 35 years. Well, how many times can we double the size of the economy? How many times can we double the size of the human population before we get to the point where we just have absurd numbers in terms of both consumption and population? Well, in many ways, we're getting to the point of absurdity now as we speak in terms of rates of consumption of non-renewable resources and renewable resources, in terms of how many people the planet can support, in terms of how much pollution the Earth can absorb. That's what climate change is all about. It's really a pollution sink dilemma. How much of the waste from our industrial processes can the global ecosystem take before it starts to shut down? Well, the signs are all around us that we're at that tipping point right now.
Yeah, and we sort of painted ourselves into a corner on many fronts, and even in the sort of theoretical world of economics and the numbers, that still has an effect in the real world. It's somewhat arbitrary. We could bin it tomorrow, but the fact is we're living under a system and abiding by the rules up to a point. I mean, for example, we've got this astronomical levels of debt, with the government, and consumer debt seems to be just about maxed out as far as I can see.
Right.
Everywhere I go, stores are having sales, and it's 0% interest, pay nothing for 5 years if you buy furniture, all that stuff. I'm sure you've seen all that stuff.
Oh, yeah.
And yet we have zero, or sometimes, in some cases, even negative interest rates. We've had this QE, quantitative easing, going on now for what seems like forever. And those are things that they're constantly talking about. Interest rates will eventually have to go up, and the government will taper the QE and what have you, but it never quite seems to happen. And the longer it goes on, the harder it is to do anything about it. And I don't honestly see how, certainly looking at the situation here in the UK, how the government could raise interest rates, or the Bank of England could raise interest rates. It would have such a huge knock-on effect. Right.
I completely agree with everything you just said. There's an essay in Afterburn on consumerism, where I talk about the history of consumerism. It's something that we tend to take for granted today, and of course, environmentalists decry consumerism, but often they paint it in sort of individualistic terms, as though consumerism were just a kind of psychological proclivity that we have, and we just need to change our attitude and be less consumptive. In fact, consumerism was a deliberate construct, and it has its roots in the early 20th century with the problem of overproduction. We had so much cheap, abundant energy in the early 20th century that we could put to work in agriculture, manufacturing, that the problem was we were making more stuff than people could buy. And so we solved that problem in a couple of ways. One was with advertising, by creating huge, trillion-dollar industry to talk people into wanting more stuff than they otherwise would. And also with consumer credit, making it easier for people to go into debt now so they could buy now and then pay off their debt later. So consume now, pay later. And so as the economy has grown, as we've made economic growth our top policy priority, we've kept the economy growing partly with expansion in the amount of consumer credit or debt. So we've gotten to the point now where most people are in about as much debt as they can take on. They can't afford to make higher payments, and the bank doesn't want to loan them much more money. So we've pretty much reached the limits to debt, at least in the consumer economy. Of course, national governments have been taking on extraordinary amounts of debt since the Great Recession as well, and that has kept the economy growing to a certain extent, but in a pretty sluggish way, as we've been saying. So at some point something has to give. And the most likely outcome is another extreme economic downturn, such as we saw in 2008. But this time around, it's going to be different because we were able to engineer a partial recovery that time using zero interest rates and quantitative easing. But those strategies have already been deployed. What are we going to do next time? It's really not clear. It's time for folks in policy positions to be planning for a no-growth economy or for a shrinking economy. I applaud the leader of your Green Party for even bringing this up in public, because I don't think we have anyone here in the United States in a policy position or who's a serious seeker of public office who's even talking about this. So as a result, we're going to be blindsided by events when we could be planning for them and making a deliberate transition to what's inevitably going to be a smaller and slower economy, which doesn't have to be a bad thing.
Politicians in the US, and in most places actually, but particularly in the US, I mean, they can't even mention any of these issues, as you pointed out. It's just that you're not even going to get started. If you get some way along in your political career and then suddenly start speaking about this stuff, you're likely to be finished. And right. If you're starting out as an aspiring politician, from that sort of standpoint, we're not going to get very far. You'll just be consigned to one of the fringe parties that no one ever gets told about or never get featured in the media. You have a sort of schizophrenic situation that you see now. Again, I'm thinking particularly here in the UK, but I know that the US and other governments are under similar pressures with so-called austerity, cutting back on public programs and public investment, benefits and what have you, in order to save money and reduce the government deficit. But on the other hand, they're going on, as I mentioned earlier, constantly about growth and about initiatives, and but you can't have widespread austerity and a booming economy. It just doesn't work like that, because even in a country like this, public spending is a very significant part of the economy.
Right. Yeah, austerity, I think, has a lot to do with expectations of returns on investments and repayment of debt. No, this is a big ball of string, and a question going through my mind is where to start pulling it apart. basically, we have a financial economy that runs on debt. And the expectation is that that debt can always be repaid as the economy grows. But if the economy stops growing, then a lot of that debt is really realistically just not going to be repayable. But the investor class doesn't want to hear that. If the economy shrinks, they want to make sure that they get theirs first. And because they are the investor class, they're the 1%, they have the ability very often to call the shots and make sure that they get their repayment, even if it's at the cost of the rest of the economy. And that's in the final analysis, that's what austerity is all about. And as you point out, it actually, as a policy, undermines the possibility of economic stability and growth, because you're taking money away from potential spenders and consumers and putting it in the hands of investors who, realistically, their share of overall consumption is much smaller, even though their per capita consumption may be very high. So this is a very wrong-headed set of policies, but we see it being pursued to the bitter end with Greece, for example, the insistence that Greece pay back its debt, which ultimately is going to have to be forgiven one way or another, at least to a certain extent. But Greece is the canary in the proverbial canary in the coal mine. If you look at the enormous amounts of debt floating around the financial world right now, and the derivatives that are on top of that debt in the so-called shadow banking system, only a tiny percentage of all of that debt is ever likely to be repayable. Ultimately, I think there's a question whether an interest-based financial system is compatible with a post-growth economy. In other words, we may have to invent a completely new kind of financial system to finance society's needed projects in the years ahead. We may even have to invent a new kind of currency, because the money that we have currently is loaned into existence by commercial banks. When you go to a commercial bank to take out a loan, that money is loaned into existence at the moment that the loan is approved. And that only works if there's the expectation of the repayment of that loan with interest. But where does the interest come from if the overall economy is not growing? There's so many problems here, and we've set ourselves up in many ways for the perfect storm of financial crashes. But that really just goes to say we should be thinking now about the economy that will emerge from the ashes of our current one. What kind of economy can persist long term in an environment of zero economic growth or economic contraction? What kind of currency will work to connect buyers and sellers and provide the service that a currency provides that doesn't depend on repayment of debt with interest?
Have you seen the film Fight Club?
Yes, I have.
Oh, you'll remember the scene then when Tyler Durden stood in the financial district and the whole place is wired up with explosives, and his vision is just to destroy it all, and there'll be no financial records left. And that kind of emphasizes how arbitrary it is, as I mentioned earlier. A lot of this is stuff on paper, on computer screens, can't be paid back, so won't be paid back, and yet we use it, like a noose to hang ourselves. And if people actually look, you mentioned earlier how all these systems have been built up during the 19th and 20th centuries predominantly, and it wasn't always the case. Of course, ancient Greece and Rome and Egypt, they all had economies and currencies and all the rest of it. But our situation is quite unlike anything that's come before. But if you look at the logic, say, for example, I did a show on the idea of a steady state economy.
Yes.
When you look at something like that, you say this is perfectly viable, perfectly doable. It gets us out of these cycles of boom and bust that we're told are natural, but of course that they're not. And so it's entirely viable. And sometimes I think people struggle with that. Even economists and politicians, they've never actually done the thought exercise to say, what else could we do? You know, so we're going to pursue this over the cliff, as it were, whereas we could just stop and turn around.
Right. Yeah. Well, it's a big turnaround. It's going to require some major re-education of a lot of economists, for one thing. And of course, it's going to require some reform to all of our economic institutions, both private institutions, banks and stock markets and all the rest, and also public institutions, the way our governments are funded. Right now, if we don't have economic growth, then how are we to fund government programs? We have to have increasing tax revenues to fund new government programs. And where do those revenues come from? Well, from economic growth. So it's easy to understand why everybody wants growth, more jobs, more tax revenues, more returns on investment. Retirees want economic growth so that they can, have more income from their retirement savings. All of these things are perfectly understandable and humanly, a given. But the reality, again, is that we live on a finite planet, so we're going to have to make some adjustments here. And people lived without economic growth right up until the 20th century. So figuring out how to get beyond growth should not be, certainly it's not impossible, and it shouldn't be that big a stretch, in fact. It is going to require some new thinking about money and currency. It's going to require more cooperative institutions like co-ops and nonprofit banks, as opposed to for-profit banking institutions and publicly traded corporations. Those latter institutions were created during the period of rapid economic growth in the expectation of more growth. So corporations, for example, are almost growth machines. They either grow or die. And it's the job of the managers of publicly traded corporations to gain market share and increasing revenues at all cost. That is the purpose of the organization, and if they don't do it, they're replaced. Whereas a cooperative can have other purposes to provide good products for consumers, good jobs for employees, and share the wealth, protect the environment in the process, and growth is not a necessity. So if we turn away from those institutions of growth toward institutions of cooperation and which also tend to be more community-based rather than global institutions, then not only could we survive the end of growth, but I think we could actually have a much happier economy as a result.
Well, as the late Michael Rupert used to say, until you change money, you change nothing. And I think that really is the key at the end of the day, because that, as we've said, it's come to sort of control everything. Everything's filtered through that lens. And our debt-based money system demands growth. That's how it functions. So that has to be changed. But I think that the money is so ill understood. I mentioned about my absolute waste of time economics course. And it's something that has begun. I noticed the local publishers here in the city where I live, they actually produce free materials for schools teaching kids about money. And they do it for free because the guy who owns the company just thinks it's something that should be done. And, which is kind of encouraging. It's very ill understood. If you talk to people in the street, do a vox pop and ask people about money system, about it's created as debt and everything else, and by privately owned banks. So this is not known at all. And I think there's a very good reason for it. And one of the frustrating things I find when this gets discussed in the media is that you'll get polarized points of view. And one of these people is lying because one says black, the other says white, and then the presenter says we're out of time. And that tends to dominate discourse about all of these subjects that we're talking about. It's still taboo, despite the threats that we're facing down. It's still taboo.
Yeah, I know what you mean. Well, money also is something that it's a tool. It's a tool of commerce. It's a tool of trade, and we need to see it in some kind of human context. It's a tool that facilitates trade and the storage and measure of wealth. But how important is that to human life? Should it really dominate our existence? There have been human societies. In fact, the vast majority of human societies were moneyless. They were what anthropologists call gift economies, where basically people just shared what they had. And as money has been created in some societies and come to dominate our society, it's done so by replacing the functions of the gift economy. The gift economy still exists, for example, in families. You're not going to charge your 5-year-old child or grandchild rent and keep a bookkeeping total of how many meals they've had and how much they cost so that they can pay you back later. No, the family is still almost entirely a gift economy. Churches, the whole nonprofit sector is in many ways a kind of gift economy. But as we do less and less for each other, and we have to replace services of the gift economy with, buying and selling and hiring, as more and more of our time is bought and sold on the market, it erodes our common humanity. Even the idea of a job is pretty recent. You go back a couple of centuries and most people were self-employed, and they thought the idea of selling the time of your life, you're selling the hours of your life as a commodity on the market was a form of slavery on the installment plan. But we take it for granted today. That's just part of the market economy that we have absorbed into our psychology and our daily life and our expectations about how the world works. Well, as time goes forward, I think a rethinking of that bargain, to use a market term, is really justified. We should think as human beings, how far should money intrude into our lives and into our communities, into our relationships, not only with each other but also with the natural world? Is nothing sacred? The realm of the sacred traditionally was that which was beyond the realm of buying and selling, the realm of the marketplace. And we're approaching a situation now where literally nothing is sacred. Everything is to be bought and sold. Even ecosystem services are being monetized. Many environmentalists are calling for this because they believe that until we monetize ecosystem services, the market won't respect them. But maybe this is exactly backwards. Maybe we should be thinking about how to contain and restrain the market rather than how to extend it into the last remaining areas where it so far has been unable to tread.
I mean, if we're honest, nobody wants a job. I mean, who in hell really wants a job? People think about it in terms usually just of getting money, as you said. And some people are lucky to do something, quote unquote, job that they actually enjoy.
Right.
Other people talk themselves into enjoying their job because they think that's best for their psychology. It'd be better if I didn't go into work every day resenting it. But at the end of the day, as you say, it's relatively recent to be defined by it. I still get it in social situations. So what do you do then? It's almost like that defines you, and we all do it. And if you say something else like, "Oh well, I'm a human being," it's mainly what I'm engaged in. They just think you're a crank. So, and we judge people even based on their jobs. Oh, what do you do? Oh, I work, I'm as we say here in Britain, a bin man, a guy who goes around collecting the trash. And it's like, oh, okay, are you? And it's like, well, maybe that person's not so smart. Well, why wouldn't we? He might have been a surgeon beforehand, but he decided he wanted to change the pace. There was a recent series of adverts in the British papers here. And, on one page, the right-hand page, you saw this guy, piercings, covered in tattoos, biker kind of guy, with long hair, big, thick set, looked really aggressive. And you turn over to the next page, and the second part of the advert shows him dressed up for surgery. He's actually a surgeon, and that's what he does. It basically just says don't judge a book by its cover, etc., etc. But I think where I want to go next is the question of population, because you're talking about jobs and then the economy going forward. We're seeing problems actually employing everyone gainfully. Some companies are going under, cutting back. The public sector's cutting back. If we look at this scenario that we're envisioning for industrial society over the medium to long term, this is likely to result in a reduced population overall. I haven't got a Malthusian bone in my body. I don't think humanity's a cancer on the planet, but I just think that the systems themselves won't support that many people going forward.
Yeah. Well, I agree. And population is a subject that we have unfortunately neglected for far too long. Sure, there have been the voices crying in the wilderness, like Paul Ehrlich, but for the most part, the assumption has been we can always increase food production to support whatever size of population we have, that it will be a self-correcting problem, the so-called demographic transition. As everybody gets rich, they'll have fewer children. And we're ultimately, if this kind of thinking is setting us up for human tragedy, because that's what is the outcome of overpopulation. And the people who will suffer most from that tragedy, of course, are the poorest members of society. And the countries that are seeing the most rapid population growth today are some of the poorest countries in the world. Many of them are in Africa. And these are countries that are going to be very, very poorly prepared to support the rapidly growing populations that are emerging there. So population growth is really a humanitarian issue. It's been framed as a humanitarian issue in just the opposite way, that anybody who was in favor of family planning and birth control is somehow anti-human, but in fact it's just the opposite. And until and unless we take population growth seriously as a problem to be addressed, we are setting ourselves up for a humanitarian catastrophe. There are organizations that are doing some really good work in this, by the way. At Post Carbon Institute, one of our fellows is a gentleman named Bill Ryerson, who has a couple of population organizations, including the Population Media Center. And they produce soap operas in the countries with the highest population growth rates, and they hire local talent to produce these soap operas that millions of people listen to, and they get hooked on the stories and they identify with the characters. But woven into the storylines are bits of information on, the role of women in families, and why shouldn't women have the ability to decide how many children they want? What's the real cost of having 4 children or 6 children as opposed to 2? And it's actually having a measurable impact on population growth rates. And the analysis that's been done shows that changing attitudes this way actually is a more cost-effective way of reducing population growth rates than anything else that's been tried.
You mentioned in one of the chapters of your book, actually, you give Egypt as an example of somewhere that's importing something like half of its food or something now. And I can't remember what the time frame is, but the population of Egypt has doubled in a surprisingly short time. And it doesn't, right. It almost seems completely insane, because you've got this country where they've got water problems, food problems, and yet, the population's ballooning. It's just sort of what's going on there, but it's probably a cultural thing. In many countries, children are associated with wealth, and they'll generate wealth, and they'll be there to look after you when you're old, etc., etc. But it's not often talked about. It was so-called Arab Spring. A lot of the problems we've seen in the Middle East have been to do with resources, specifically food and water. And that's where a lot of that trouble has come from. It underlies it, but it's not talked about that way. It's talked about just in political terms. And also, much in the news at the minute is the migrants coming in ramshackle boats from North Africa to get into the European Union. And in the last 2 weeks, there's been something like 1,000 people have drowned. And again, they're obviously, economic migrants. Perhaps people would cite the environment and that, but generally speaking, there's not enough attention being paid to these phenomena we're seeing now and how they relate to the overall subject we're talking about. These are early indicators that, the whole system as a whole is in trouble.
Absolutely. Until we seriously address resources and population, we're setting ourselves up again for humanitarian and political catastrophes. Political catastrophes usually come in the form of wars and revolutions with lots of violence attached. So, we look in the news, in the daily paper, and we see violence erupting, or we see an economy failing. We see a humanitarian catastrophe, and we think it must be the leadership. And in a way, we're right, because we are seeing a failure of leadership almost across the board around the world right now. But the failure of leadership is not just in a failure to produce jobs and economic growth. The failure in leadership really is to understand the linkages between the economy, resources, and population, and to chart a path toward a steady state economy in which population is stable or declining, so that future generations can enjoy a way of life that is satisfying, that is stable, that is where there actually is a future, something to look forward to. Right now, when we look at these things, it's pretty depressing, because it looks like the future is going to be not so good. And when you talk to millennials, people who've come of age since the turn of the millennium, a lot of them have this sense that, everything's been used up, and what's left for us? Well, this is a terrible legacy to leave to the next generation. And with the time that's available to us in a lifetime, and it's not that long, 60, 70, 80 years, it's really up to us to understand these very basic human ecological issues and come to grips with them, rather than just ignoring them, passing the buck, or pretending that somehow we're exempt from them. Real leadership is, in the final analysis, it's ecological leadership.
I did an entire show with your colleague David Fridley regarding the fact that we cannot have industrial society as we've known it on renewables, but it's worth just raising that so that people listening to this who maybe haven't listened to that show, one of the popular objections is, well, we're making such great advances with renewables, but the bottom line is that there's this thing called, the sort of net energy, and how much more net energy there was available from fossil fuels as compared to solar, wind, whatever it happens to be. And there's also all sorts of other issues with those when they're being intermittent, etc. And also nuclear that only survives with huge subsidies. We still don't know what to do with the waste. So there isn't a plan B. There isn't something that we could switch over to gradually or quickly.
Right. Well, I work for an organization called Post Carbon Institute, and David Fridley is a close associate of mine. We're actually working on a big project together right now called Our Renewable Future. And so with a name like Post Carbon Institute, as you can imagine, we are advocates of renewable energy. We want the world to get off of fossil fuels and get to a renewable future as quickly and in as orderly a way as possible. But we need to be realistic about what that transition is going to look like and what the future holds for us with renewable energy. It would be possible to transition all of our electricity to solar and wind. It's going to take some time, and there are some problems along the way. Developing better batteries and affordable energy storage is a big one because of that intermittency problem. But, here in the U.S., I'm not sure what the U.K. figure is, but here in the U.S., electricity is 18% of final consumed energy. All the rest is liquid fuels for transportation. It's fuels for producing heat for houses, buildings, and for industrial processes, for road building. The list goes on and on. And it's much more difficult to substitute renewable sources of energy for fossil fuels in those applications. It's going to take a lot of inventiveness to find ways of substituting, for example, solar thermal for ways we currently produce heat with fossil fuels. But also, we're going to have to realistically think about, what do we really need to have done for us by energy? And what can we let go of? Because with cheap fossil fuels, we mechanized and energized a lot of activities that previously either we just didn't do or did with muscle power or did much more slowly or on a smaller scale. And realistically, that's what we're headed toward in an all renewable future. We're headed toward a slower scale, smaller economy where we do more things for ourselves, where we do more things with muscle power. And that doesn't have to be a terrible future to contemplate. But the transition is the thing. And knowing where we're going and having an expectation that that's where we're going is really important.
Yeah, and I think that's what I'd like to think we're trying to do here in some small way is just start to outline a vision, and maybe sometime along the future, the mainstream will start to do this. Politicians and decision makers will start to do this to begin to hint at what might lie beyond industrial society, pure consumerism, that it isn't all bad. I think it's like a lot of things in human nature, isn't it? That we don't like the unknown. And when we tend to imagine something to put in place of the unknown, it's quite often negative. But there's no real reason to think that. Yes, we're definitely going to face some pain. Maybe a lot of it, in the next coming decades. But somewhere out the other side of that, there is something better. Life will go on. I don't, for example, think that we're facing near-term human extinction. I've had Guy McPherson on because I wanted to talk to him, but I don't subscribe to that. I just think that their life will go on and it can be better. It's just maybe not in our lifetimes, but in the future.
Yeah, and almost every day I talk to someone or share emails with someone who is doing something already that's a transitional activity, whether it's in transportation with, inventing some new human-powered vehicle to meet a particular need, or in communications or healthcare or you name it, who's aware of all the stuff we've been talking about over the last hour and is actually doing something that will make the transition occur or enable the transition to occur. And these people generally, I have to say, are smart, happy people. Even if they understand the scale of the challenge ahead of us, they know that life can be better because they've seen part of it for themselves. My wife and I have been at this for some time too, just in our own personal lives. We have just a kind of conventional California suburban home, but we grow a lot of our own food. We catch rainwater. We heat our water with solar energy. We generate our own electricity, the little bit that we use, and it's a good way to live. So, when you've had a taste of it, the future looks a lot less scary.
Yeah, and I could get negative there and talk about how governments are spending a lot of their time clamping down on people trying to do things for themselves, with zoning regulations and all the rest of it. And it's just a way to try and cover up the inevitable. And at this stage in the game, we would expect them to do that. At some point, maybe they'll get around to actually working with people. Because as you point out, there's a lot we can do individually, but there are some things that really need to be done on a systematic basis.
That's absolutely true.
I don't know if you've ever read the book Fahrenheit 451, but I like to think going forward that individual action is important. And in that book, it's where books are actually banned and they're all burned. But these individual people take it upon themselves to memorize an entire book. So they become like walking books, and the books don't die. They're carried around with people. And I'm using this as an analogy for things we can do going forward. Learn an outdated skill, preserve a piece of culture, just something, one little step that, and then even if you never use that in your day-to-day life, maybe your son or daughter can, maybe your nephew or niece or your brother, somewhere down the line, just to try and preserve what's important about human culture as we move through this transition.
Yeah, absolutely right. I have an article or a chapter in the book, Afterburn, called Our Evanescent Culture and the Awesome Duty of Librarians, that addresses exactly what you're talking about. Yeah, we have more information and culture and experiential stimulation available to us than any generation in history before us. But so much of it is evanescent. It's stored as electronic blips that could disappear tomorrow. Imagine if we had a solar storm that, like the Carrington event of the 19th century, it would wipe out computer disks and computer networks and server farms, and we'd be basically left without this enormous information storage and means of communication that we rely on today for just about everything. Well, we've put too much of our culture into these very vulnerable forms, and we need to retake much of it into our memories, where it needs to be relived and revivified, both in action and also in teaching, personal one-on-one, face-to-face teaching. And I think we'll gain a lot in the process in human terms, which we were talking about earlier. The economy runs on electrons these days as much as it does on fossil fuels, but human culture runs on face-to-face interaction, and we've given up too much of that in favor of the electronic.
Richard, today we've been talking about your latest book, which is once again called Afterburn, Society Beyond Fossil Fuels. That's available everywhere, all the usual outlets, as I like to say. But maybe you've got a website or websites you'd like to share with folks, and anything else you want to put out there?
Sure. Well, my personal website is richardheinberg.com, but the first place I would send folks is Post Carbon Institute's website, resilience.org. It's the first website I check out every morning because it has news and articles that relate to everything we've been talking about in the last hour, both in terms of what's going on with fossil fuel supply issues, with renewables, with the sharing economy and the post-growth economy, permaculture, all of that. And it's one of the best aggregation websites I've seen because of its focus on those subjects.
Excellent. Well, Richard, thank you so much for joining us today on legalizefreedom.com.
Thank you, Greg. It's been a pleasure talking with you.
Well, folks, that's it for another week. As ever, thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed the show, check out the website, which is legalizefreedom.com. That's legalize-freedom.com, where you'll find an archive of programmes offering alternative views on a wide range of topics including politics and economics, energy and environment, culture, spirituality, history, and the nature of reality. You can also browse and buy a range of publications from our guests, and if you're feeling generous, make a donation to help keep the site up and running. Based on current audience numbers, if everyone who tuned in donated just 5 pence per show, that's about 8 cents US, this could become a full-time, fully funded operation, offering more and more often. During October 2014, over 50,000 of you streamed or downloaded at least one show. Total donations were £7 UK, which currently converts to about $11 US. Whether you listen, donate, or do both, I greatly appreciate your support. Until next time, I'm Greg Moffat, and you've been listening to LegalizeFreedom.com.